Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. All right, everyone. Today we have Ashley Robinson, the CEO of the Seaker Group. She is an expert in all things retail real estate, and you're going to be able to see that in this podcast. She's led real estate at brands like Coldwater Creek, Kona Grill, and Hobdoddy, but uniquely with Ashley, she has also worked the other side of the equation as a property owner as well. So the point of this show is to go through Seaker's The 10 Things methodology for retail expansion. But first, Ashley, I want to start with Seaker. Why does the Seaker Group exist?
Yeah, I think it's a great segue, Lyden, and thanks for having me. I was just mentioning to you before we started, I appreciate the time you take for all of us in the industry to learn from each other. Learning is a core element of why Seeker exists, just to have a constant appetite for growth. So I will my quick explanation to that is, I spent 20 years trying to help concepts grow. You mentioned some of them where I was in-house, but I was also a consultant helping big international and local concepts expand. And I learned so much about why they succeeded, but also why they fail. Many people know that there's an 80% failure rate in the first 3 years for starting up restaurants. The number is almost as high for retail. And this just created this almost burned some curiosity in me at a very early stage where I just wanted to figure out why. Why is this the case that so many concepts fail? And as you mentioned, I went in house with various different companies, the landlord side, but I also went in house with the data company and was building these deep learning models. And what I discovered from switching the table so many times and wearing so many hats was you could really boil it down to three things. The first thing is we often don't use the scientific method. Many of us are operators. If you're in the C-suite, you're expected to have conviction, and often you're expected to have answers, not necessarily focus on the right questions. So, scientific method, number one. Number two, for those operators who use science, it's easy to forget the art. So, not applying a healthy mix of art and science is another reason that concepts fail. And the third is not taking a holistic and cyclical approach. So, holistic meaning not thinking through all of the various departments and sales drivers and cost drivers that a company needs to measure, and then not using that data post opening to find success. Everything is siloed from a department perspective, from a linear perspective, when people start planning growth. So often, real estate gathers great information that never makes its way to operations or to marketing. It's very complicated, but those are kind of three simple reasons that most people can wrap their head around. And Seeker was created to solve for that.
So it sounds like part of this with the holistic understanding is you got a good feeling for what a profit and loss is for these companies because you actually were responsible for that. And then there's the data side of the equation, which people kind of like focus like those are the nerds that do that. But then there's also this art piece when there's some retail brands that literally you cannot pencil them on paper, but they go off like a rocket. Maybe because of something cultural, maybe something that you just don't know about the people in the area that resonate with that. Okay, I'm really interested in getting into the art piece, but let's do this. Let's go through the 10 things. What is the 10 things and how exactly did you come up with it?
Yes, so this is a culmination of 20 years of working in the business and filing away learnings. And I worked with many companies who, we use the tools that are out there. So many people, are selling a magic bullet or the crystal ball of we can tell you what your top line sales are going to be. And there's a lot of problems with only focusing on top line revenue. And the obvious, problem is we need to be profitable.
Hmm.
And the variables in our costs have changed drastically in the last 5 to 10 years. So labor costs, which are typically 30 to 35% of an operator's P&L, if not more, COGS, which is typically 30% of the P&L. These things often go unmeasured in the real estate planning process. And so often we're focused just on occupancy costs because real estate is leading that effort, which is only typically 10 to 8% of the P&L. Again, these are one of the reasons that people fail. So the 10 things is a way to take the millions of variables that will impact someone's profitability, bucket them into 10 things that we can actually model around, and make sure that we're capturing the sales drivers and the cost drivers that change market to market, sites to site, to allow a decision maker to make a decision off of something that feels objective, quantifiable, and then back to those, 3 reasons for failure, using the scientific method, mixing the art and science, and taking a holistic approach instead of
You know,
focusing on one of the silos.
one of the things I like about what you're talking about is almost like the 10 things gives you this common language within a company to get a deal done. And just if you're the data scientist and the retailer, you then have awareness of the bottom half of the P&L, and you know you need to communicate not only, okay, this is, expect revenue to be this, but we think it'll be profitable, and then you're on the same page with somebody who's actually running that, which is that's really cool. Let's go to thing number one, market build out and sequencing. Tell me about thing number one here.
So this is one that changes. You could think about the 10 things as being applied on a market level if you were trying to prioritize markets across the country, and then you double click each one to the site level. So the 10 things don't change if you're trying to prioritize markets or sites, with the exception of number one. So as we're
Okay.
looking at trying to compare markets to each other, we want to know if one market would allow us to build 10 units and another market allows us to build two. It's very clear to anyone which market you should prioritize when you say it in those simple terms. On a site level, we want to be able to understand, now that we've chosen this market, is this the right sequencing of this location? The typical influence of any operator or restaurant is their financial partners wanting them to be very profitable early on in a market. And oftentimes that encourages people to pick a cheap real estate, either cheap rent or a second gen space that is a low investment, but oftentimes the right location that captures the mind share of the consumer is not the most affordable
Mm,
place to be. So being very intentional about the sequencing of how to introduce yourself to the consumer in a market is really critical. And if somebody opens in what should be the third or fifth location first, they may never get to the fifth location in that market because the way that they sequenced, confused the consumer about who they are and what they're offering. So this is something that
yeah.
feels, subjective, but it can be very objective and built into a model.
Oh man, sequencing equals success. So it's like that
Yes.
first location that you pick that's a billboard. That's almost like your billboard, and it's also your brand recognition, right? Because people are going to associate you with that neighborhood, ideally or not ideally, depending on your selection there. I have so many questions. Okay, can we talk about sequencing first? So when you have a market, what is your method for determining how many of those locations that market will bear for the brand?
This is one of the hardest thing for people to figure out in planning. There's a couple of different ways to do it. I think the most basic way that people apply is, let's look at the population. And if we believe that we can, service one store for every 500,000 people, for example, how many stores does that equal? There's a lot of mistakes to doing it that way that I think people are aware of, and the right way changes from client to client depending on your sensitivities. But we will also look at how many people are spending money in this market. If you take a market like Seattle or San Diego, for example, both have populations of around 4 million people, depending on how you're measuring, the population of those markets. But if you look at the various major shopping centers within those markets, we can quantify that there are 8 million people spending money, unique visitors spending money in those markets. So it's really easy to underestimate the opportunity in a market if you're only looking at population, especially in tourist driven markets, and not account for, tourists that are coming and spending money there. Now, you don't want to obviously, overestimate that either. You want to look at them as gravy, but these are just some of the elements that we would look to is number one, how many unique visitors are coming to this market? Number two, what is the customer pool of that population? So if we're really clear that our customer fits, XYZ criteria, how many of those customers are in that population? And that customer pool then becomes the math equation that you're using to figure out how many stores per market.
Okay, so customer pools, that's a more refined way of saying population. It's like, well, how many of our actual target customers are in here? And then you're almost talking about this hidden population, which I'm curious how you kind of quantify that, which is tourism. And I guess it could come from other things. Is there any variable that you're looking at that would indicate there's tourism other than just like, yeah, we know people are visiting LA more than they're visiting Cincinnati.
Absolutely. It's so funny because Orlando's a great example of this. You hear people all the time, they'll say, 73 million people come to Orlando. But really, a lot of more people are using things like Placer or Mutual Partner mobile data counters. Oftentimes it's actually 73 million visits maybe coming to a certain area. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really important to understand that distinction between visitors and visits, and being able to account for unique visitors is something Placer's been really valuable to help people with. And just being smart about the methodology to get there. But with mobile phones, we're able to track unique devices and count for those unique visitors in a way that we weren't able to 5 years or more ago.
That's great. Yeah, and you can you can also depict the vibrancy of an area based on how many people are going there. So sequencing, how do you determine what is the first spot to place a brand in the market?
Absolutely. So I use this example all the time. Anyone who's talked to me also maybe has heard this, but a great example to use is, let's think about Manhattan, which most people understand. In our business, they've been to Manhattan, they understand Times Square. If we had a trendy, let's say we had a trendy salad concept who was chasing highly educated influencer, young, think trendy young individual, healthy individuals in New York, and really trying to chase the locals. Thinking about how to sequence New York would be so important. If you simply asked the data, where should we go in Manhattan? The data might tell you, well, highest traffic equals highest sales equals good real estate, and therefore you should go to Times Square. But we all know, right, that the individuals who are living in New York would take that real estate decision to say that this is a tourist driven, big chain. This is not for me. And they would probably be alienated very quickly, which is why you see people come in and go to Williamsburg or, various smaller pockets of Manhattan where they know that this local consumer is coming on a more frequent basis. So oftentimes it's where is that local consumer going, or where is that target demographic, my target consumer, going on a weekly basis, knowing that that might not be the highest top performing location, but you are earning the right to at some point open in those higher traffic locations. And once you're there, everyone knows you and loves you. It's okay. But this is very much the strategy that Sweet Green followed when they were expanding, and other restaurants and retailers who were able to command outsized valuations. It's because they made those brand driven decisions, oftentimes in market sequencing, that didn't necessarily make the most financial sense on paper in a pro forma, but did make sense from a long-term valuation perspective. And again, this sounds subjective, but you can model this, and this is something that we do model into our strategy.
What are you using to model that?
Seeker Systems this is our
Okay.
company, right? This is our
Yeah.
model that we have built, is building these previously subjective concepts into ways of putting objective metrics into a structure that's easier to follow.
Let me play that back to you to make sure I'm getting it. It sounds like one of those things where you like the vibe, your vibe attracts your tribe. So would this be, I think that you use Times Square as an example. Times Square should be the highest performing real estate. But we know those are probably mainly tourists going there. So if you wanted to attract tourists, if that's your customer, that's where you should be. But you use Sweet Green as your example. It's when some of these people are like attracting, they're going to Williamsburg to get maybe that young professional crowd. It's almost like, okay, who is my customer? And then also who is aspirationally my customer in this market? And then locating right there. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. Yes, Light, and you're exactly right. So it's the metrics that you're using to define good, right? So in that entry level location, you should be focused on the consumer, and those consumer metrics that we partner with you on so often with Spatial is so critical for this aspect of our business, and also brand building, which we'll get to as another 10 things,
Yeah.
is saying, is our customer going to this location at a higher index than they exist throughout the market? And Spatial's been so helpful to define that. And whereas what we call our type 2 sites or our market awareness sites, traffic would be the primary indicator of, are we getting the most eyeballs on our site? Now, those are different definitions of good, but are really important distinctions to make. And then our other distinction is the site making us the most money? And oftentimes people lead with those metrics, which are purely a pro forma, and they forget about the customer. And that's where mistakes
Hmm.
happen. So
Okay.
just like we talked about, Placer helping us on the traffic side, I think, where Spatial has been so helpful is quantifying and qualifying the consumer who is so critical in your long-term success. But it's been hard to make that objective previously.
Yep. Cool. Okay. We already touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about multi-unit efficiencies. Thing number two.
Okay, I'm going to nerd out on this one. I love this. If you think about any of us who've worked on real estate, you have a pro forma, which identifies and reflects a single unit's economics. The challenge with that is if most of us, if you're a QSR, fast casual, or restaurant, you need 3 units to hit operational efficiencies. And what that means is you might have one district manager who's overseeing 3 locations. Well, you also have shipping costs, like we talked about COGS. Oftentimes your shipping costs reflect the same cost if you have 5 locations as if you have one location. So think about those costs spread over 5 versus 1 location. And knowing what those efficiencies are, if it's 3 stores or 5 stores, is really critical. If we're looking at a market that can only hold 2 versus a market that can hold 7, you know that all 7 locations will be benefiting on their bottom line, right? With profitability. You should also know the market with 2 will never hit optimal
Yes.
profitability. So, and now take that to a site level. If I'm presenting, hey, we only have the money to open 1 location and we have 2 opportunities, we should know how much that one side or the other will impact the efficiencies of all the others in the market. What if that's the fifth store in a market that then increases profitability on the other 4? And that is not something that has been historically in our industry that we think about when we're presenting opportunities in a pro forma or in a real estate committee.
I
And
love this.
this is again something that we model.
Does this matter more for restaurants or apparel retailers or straight retail? Which does it matter for the most?
It does matter for retail that open in multiple locations. If somebody has 1 location in a market only, it's obviously less important. And I would say retail is absolutely important, especially on the operational and shipping side. For restaurants, I would say it's critical. It is a
Mm.
almost a life or death critical element that very often is overlooked.
So if a retailer came to you with a strategy, like we just want the best spot in every market, or a restaurant company would come to you, you would say you actually need to consider the efficiencies of how many multiple locations in a singular market. Am I understanding that right?
Well, first of all, I would say define best. And you'd be surprised how little can actually define that,
Mm.
right? How are we defining good at this point? What does best mean? And again, that's where the 10 things come in because so many things are important when you're saying what is the best site or what is the best market. There's so many things to consider, and the 10 things allows you to consider all of those things as well as your definition for good. Are we defining this as, giving us the most brand value, the most brand
Mm.
awareness, or just the most profitable? Because those often are different outcomes.
Yeah, I love this. Now your holistic comment is starting to come, and I can see you working at like Kona Grill, etc. And I'm seeing you discovering these things. Like I can see where this comes from. This is really cool. Okay.
Well, and not to
Um,
mention all the various clients I've worked with as their real estate leader professional. There's been probably 20 to 25 more. We've worked with big companies like Netflix down to really small companies, like restaurants in LA that have, 2 to 5 units, who are great. So everyone in between, we learn something new from every type of retailer or restaurant that we work into our solutions.
okay. Consumer perception. Oh no, this is the art one. I'm ready for this one.
This is great. So a one easy way to think about this question is for any operator out there. If somebody knew nothing about your business other than the city where you were located or the real estate location where you were located, what would that tell them about your brand? That's a very simple question to ask that shows why it's so important to think about these questions. If you want to open a pizza concept and you open in Chicago, that's where people think about, right? They think about, oh, this must be a very legit pizza concept if they're in Chicago versus a, less known, smaller market. And same thing, obviously, with real estate. If you are trying to open an elevated, polished restaurant with a pretty high price point, and you are open in front of a Walmart, that is telling the opposite message to your customer of who you are and what you're trying to present yourself as. If you are opening a value driven concept, Walmart is perfect. It doesn't mean Walmart is good or bad. It just means being very clear about who you are, your brand, and who your customer is, and then making sure that your market and your sites are aligning, with that mission.
How do you justify this though if you are in that real estate meeting?
Yeah, how do we quantify this?
Well, if I'm just thinking about like if I'm making a pitch to my real estate director and I've got two locations, one is just like it's cheaper or whatever, it's just better on paper. And the other one, I was boots on the ground. I saw it. I was like, this connects with my brand. How in the world do you make that argument?
So it starts with the foundation, and this is the infrastructure side of what Seeker does. Is we come in. You should never be having this argument in real estate committee, but I have so many times, and I've seen it so many times that this is again why Seeker exists. There has to be infrastructure in your strategy that already addresses the fact that these things matter. And if you
Mm,
look at, I use the example of Lululemon, very well known operator, people understand. Their strategy was not to go to the cheapest real estate or the highest revenue real estate. Their strategy was go to where there was the most density of yoga studios. And it was a way to show authenticity with the brand. And there's a reason why they were trading at 69x when their peers were trading at, 12 to 14x. The proof of the pudding is in those valuations of these companies that you can look back and see. I use the examples of so often of, Nike and Apple and others who are very, the most well-known brand centric operators out there who are able to command those outsized valuations. And most people will agree with that premise and understand that premise, which allows them for the infrastructure to be built to say, hey, if we can prove that this decision is to help us build toward that through X, Y, and Z metrics, then we should be approving these sites. They still need to be profitable, by the way. They just might not be the highest performing location as the first location in the market, but they need to be. We need to be able to address that we're conscious of the customer and the brand and making those brand driven decisions and not just
yeah,
financially driven decisions that end up eroding the brand and eroding
that
value.
that makes so much sense. Is this needs to be a conversation beforehand before it comes into that real estate committee. where you've looked at these 10 points, you've agreed this is your strategy, and so when you have this location come up, we're all in agreement on we've already done the pre-thinking about what we want our brand to be associated with. Okay, top line revenue. This is thing. What are we on? Thing number 4.
And before we move on, I have to say this too, Lyden, if this is where our spatial data comes in, that's so important. When we are looking at those brand driven consumer perception sites and we want to make sure that our target consumer is there, the metrics we use are spatials metrics, right? The spatials psychographic segmentation saying these are the core customers that we want to be our influencers in the market. They might not be the biggest group, but they're the most important group to capture first. And that is quantified through spatials data and made objective. And it's been so exciting and helpful.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here, but I
Yeah.
mean, I'm
Yeah.
all in on people's behaviors and their attitudes over just their demographics. Like demographics are important, like 100%. But there's a lot of nuance to people that where they behave in ways you wouldn't totally expect their demographics. And this is where I just think that there's a huge opportunity for retailers in particular and restaurants to capture on like, this is quantifiable now, 100% quantifiable. Like we can put a number to this decision.
100%.
Cool. All right. And I think we're on thing number 4, top line revenue.
This is the core element that drives most people's growth. And yes, it's very important. It's also where so many mistakes are made. There are various tools out there who build these very complicated revenue models. I went in-house with data companies. I built these. I think the challenges are oftentimes we have data people who have not been operators building these models. And those of us who are operators don't realize how many assumptions are made with data people to build those models. And those assumptions require it's often like a business acumen or experience to make the proper assumptions. So an example would be when I was working with one of these companies, they looked at a fleet of business and the top performing unit happened to be a freestanding pad without any co-tenancy. So the assumption they pulled from that was, well, your future sites should be sitting by themselves without any co-tenancy. And then the model was leading us to, vacant shopping centers that had died. Right. So this is just a very, this is like one of those, of course, that's not the right outcome or that's not the right assumption to take from that data point. But it's if we let data run away with these models without, the art side of the business, the experience side of the business, oftentimes they will model incorrectly, and then that's where the operators lose trust in those models. So our approach to top line revenue is very different. It's the opposite of a black box. It's a glass box where I want every one of my clients to be able to gut check these assumptions and say, you don't need to be a data scientist. But if I can tell you, here's how much, here's the data makeup of this new site, and here's how the data compares to an existing site and the assumptions that we're making. Do you think you can capture, you know, 10% less traffic than you capture at this other location? Do you think you
Mhm.
can charge this type of price point, which is similar to what you charge at this other location? Those types of examples that any CEO or CFO can easily gut check and say, yes, I believe this, I'm convicted in this, or no, that scares me, I can't approve this site. That's what we're delivering with Seeker, especially around top line revenue, is the operators have to understand those assumptions and be behind them and then be able to hold their team accountable to those. And also, if they're not hitting those top line projections, they need to know why. And it's not good enough just to say, well, the model told us we would do, 4.5, and we're only doing 3. So it's got to be the real estate, which is what typically happens. And then the real estate people say, no, it's a bad manager. And then everyone says, but there was no marketing. And then you have this blame game and CYA issue happening where people are so afraid to talk about what went wrong that you never discover how to solve those problems, and then those stores end up
Mm,
closing. So this
mm.
is this is inevitably what happens when there's a black box and there's a lack of clarity of where that scientific experiment went wrong. So having that checklist of, are we getting the trade area we assumed, yes or no? Are we able to, are we paying the labor costs that we assumed? Yes or no? What is our price point? What are those assumptions that went into the model, and what is passing and failing those
Hmm.
assumptions, to get a very clear direction of how to solve for that underperforming store. And that's the cyclical and holistic part of the three that we started with.
I love the glass box concept, and I love the social issue that it solves because I've seen that happen before, where this some location isn't operating as you would expect. And then if you have all these numbers and you can have a really objective conversation, labor's hard to move that one. Maybe you know a little bit more on how to do that, but if it's like marketing or if it's some of these other things, we can clearly tweak it if we need to, but you can't even get there if you don't have the numbers in front of you to be able to have that conversation.
Exactly. And as an executive, if you're expecting the various departments to have it and come to you and say, "Hey, this is where we missed," it just it's a unreasonable expectation. But if you have a model that is holistic in nature, then you can address it holistically and strategically, instead of it feel like, finger pointing.
Every once in a while, you'll learn something new, and I'm having some light bulbs go off. But then it actually points back to a really core human thing that's always been true, which is communication. Like a
Yes.
lot of what we're talking about here, like we're talking about models, we're talking about consumer segments, but all we're digging it down to okay, there's like really clear communication happening with the team when we use these 10 points.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Okay, let's get into number 5, construction costs. So now we're on the
So
bottom half, the cost
we're
side of the
moving into
P&L.
costs. That's right. And we structure these like a P&L. Like you said, these are sales drivers, right? You typically have your credits at the top of a P&L, and then you have your costs at the bottom. And that's how we should be thinking about our business and strategic growth. So construction cost is pretty simple. It's really easy on a site level because you have to go and create a budget. It's harder often on a market level. And we know there's certain markets that, they require union labor, or just the labor costs in general are higher. And by the way, this is shifting constantly when it comes to supplies and materials, and it's something that's really hard to keep a pulse on. But we have some great data partners that allow us to update an index on a pretty frequent basis. So it is a big part of growth. If you were coming in and opening 5 locations in a market within 2 years, the construction, if and that market is 18% more expensive than another market where you're building 5 locations, that's a massive, swing of your returns for those costs that often go completely unmeasured. So we are indexing markets against each other from a construction cost, which includes supply and labor. And then on a site level, we are measuring, being able just to capture it in a way that is one of those 10 things that matters when you're prioritizing sites. It, it's complicated, but it's simple to understand, unlike some of these other ones.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Is there any other thing that you look there, like tax or incentives on cost?
On a site level, yeah, we would incorporate those, and that would typically go into a budget.
Okay. Oh, this is fun. Competition and market share.
Oh man, we could have a whole podcast just on this one, right? This is, I would say, the hardest thing for most people to measure. And it's complex because specifically market share almost as a separate thing from competition. Market share itself means, how much of the pie, right, do you think that
Hmm.
you can take? So to measure that, you want to see in a market that there is enough demand for what your service is. Now, so often if you see a lot of your competitors in a market, that is actually a signal of demand,
Yes.
right? So you don't want to go to a market or a site that has no competition, because that's also a signal that there's not enough demand.
Hmm.
So being able to say, well, we want to be where there's competitors, but we also need to be able to capture and measure, is there enough market share left for us with all of those competitors there? And do we believe that we can steal market share? If these competitors are outperforming offerings, if they can provide more value, or if they can provide a better product, for less value, there's probably less market share for you to steal there. So there's many onions to how deep people want to go with this question. But from a very top high level, we look at spend data of how much are people spending in a very specific category and how many competitors are there. So, and that will give you just some basic indications. We call them just like signals of, is there enough demand, and then is there abundant supply where we would have to be stealing market share, or is there still some sort of available market share that makes it easier to come in and instantly capture those dollars?
When you're talking about the spend data, are you looking at the BLS spend data like at a NAICS code level as part of that?
We have several different data sources that we use, and oftentimes we have information from the client as well. So, if they're multi-channel, if they know that they have online sales, for example.
Yeah,
Um, so there's so many different data sources for this specifically, and then some new ones coming online as well. So we try to be agnostic and use the right data source for the client for their specific use. And you can imagine that, a restaurant like we work with Born, who has some really great restaurant data. And you can imagine that a retailer or an entertainment concept have different data sources that you'd want to pull within their own
sure,
industry.
sure. Um, when you think about assessing who the competition is, how do you assess who like really is the competition? What are you looking at?
I love this one because so often if you ask an operator who are your competitors, I think that they often are blind to the competition because they are, um, living their brand and they're confident about what they're offering. And they think, well, these people aren't our competition. We have no competition because no one does what we do just like us. And I think it's a mistake. We try to back out and say, people only have so much disposable income. What are they spending that income on in that market? So if I was talking to an entertainment concept yesterday who was very specific and unique and said this, we don't have any competition. And I said, well, I would want to look at what are people spending on for entertainment out of the house, not in the house entertainment, but out of the house entertainment. You are competing for those dollars, whether you think that they're your competitor or not. You are competing for those dollars, and it's a mistake not to measure those things. Now that's like very high level, right? And then when it gets even more direct, then you can say, well, who's a competitor that we would want to have, you know, um, protection on our lease against? If we come in, then this
Mm,
other kind of concept can't come in. That's very specific competition where you would say, is it the same primary use as defined by XYZ, our primary use, right? So I think different definitions are required for the question that you're asking.
I've seen a few different takes on this. One take I've seen is you have direct competition. Okay. Can you merchandise better than them? Then it might make sense to locate right next to them. Or in the case of jewelry concepts, they do better when they're right next to each other. Like if you get a bunch of
Yes.
jewelry concepts that they all get in the same place, it's like that's
Yes.
actually good for them. And then I've heard another take where is like, okay, you have like this like I can't remember. Someone they're going to get the retailers wrong, but you have let's say it's a big furniture store and it's drawing the big square footage. It's drawing the right customer. But then you have a specialty furniture store that they have an assortment that that big one does not. So they would actually want to locate near them, even though they're going to directly compete with them.
Yes.
They have enough level of gravity where they're actually going to draw more things. And I think really in the end it's like it's an assortment thing where like you would actually want to be close to competition.
You're right. There's a category element, and we saw this. We did a lot of work with Cotopaxi, and that outdoor lifestyle brands are the same way. They might be all selling, outdoor apparel or outdoor, lifestyle goods, but they do better when they are around their peers, which by the way, they are competing for the same dollar,
Uh-huh.
but they are still drafting off each other in terms of gaining the most available customers into one. one area. And this is, again, this is why it's complicated. Or, Marugame, who's another client of ours, they do want to be around other authentic Asian operators. But I would just say, like, this aspect is a great example of when you tell people, or when you say, people like, tell me what a good site is, or show me good sites, or what is a tool that can help me, find good real estate? This is a great question to help people understand why it's so important to clarify what good means. And is competition a good thing or a bad
Yeah.
thing? This is something we built our model to be able to capture, is that we can't assume that competition in the area it should negatively impact your model, because since in so many concepts it could be a positive indicator. And it's just a great example of why this is a complex business that we're in, and being really clear on what,
Yeah.
how to define good is in and of itself its own project.
Would you say that being clear on how to define good that is the 10 things? Like if you can be clear on these 10 things, then you have correctly defined
Absolutely.
good.
Yep. And because this is it is an indicator, and it is able to, estimate profitability. So at the end of the day, most people will say, well, we want to be profitable, but getting there is the challenge, right? Being able to get there at scale and long term is much harder.
Mhm. Okay. Um, let's talk about labor and business climate.
I definitely have some stories on this one. I think this is a well-known, it's well known in our industry that effective wage is more important than minimum wage. But that was not the case, 5, 10, 15 years ago. If you look at minimum wage across the country and you look over like the last 20 years, some states have skyrocketed. Other states have tip credit where you can have an operator paying, someone back of house $2.50 in Texas. And that same position requires $25 an hour in a market like Seattle. Now multiply that
Hmm.
through multiple units, right, and locations, and think about the impact that that would have on the bottom line. So it's a big issue, and this, the stories I have of why this became so important is I was working in real estate 15 years ago, in San Francisco, which is a very expensive market, and I worked 3 years with a very well known restaurant. 3 years on a prime location, right off Union Square. And it went to lease finally, and it was killed because they didn't realize how expensive the effective wage was. They were modeling minimum wage.
Hmm.
And it was a light bulb moment for me that I realized, wow, this is one of the biggest companies in the country, and they are not using this really important metric up front in their strategy. And here I am as a partner who just wasted 3 years on I was killed by a data point that was available to this operator 3 years ago, and they chose not to use.
Hmm.
So it has it's a morale issue, it's a resource issue, and I would just say there's no excuse at this point for people to not be taking something that is such a big impact on the P&L into consideration before they leverage human resources and other resources in their growth strategy.
When you say the data point was available, is the data point like call up the restaurants nearby and the retailers nearby and say, "What are you
Yeah,
paying
there's
your
there's
people?" When I'm saying versus minimum, we know minimum is like that's like a state thing or the
it was
effective.
much
How do you get
harder.
that?
Definitely, it was much harder to achieve this previously, but it was possible. It All the restaurants all talk. You can definitely call any. The restaurants will talk to each other. Even something like Indeed, right? Indeed is a great resource for a lot of people to be able to
Okay.
say, okay, what is a manager role or a salary position require in this area? And then also looking at, we always have business climate too. If there's a very low, um, if there's not a lot of available staff, that is also going to be a hiring issue, which will impact your effective wage going higher to, because you have to go poach people from another business. But unemployment is also another indicator. If an area has very low unemployment, there should be an assumption that that business climate will be more challenging. and or if they have a big
Yeah.
college presence and the college students are, your kind of target staff, then that would be an easier business climate to achieve on labor.
That is so good. That is so good to I mean, I just feel like people don't look at this because 'cause they're so focused on the dollars coming in. But it feels like it's also a cliff on both edges because you could say, "All right, what's the unemployment here? Super low unemployment. It's a great place for business, but it's hard to get people. And then what's the employment here? Super high unemployment. Well, why?
Yes, right.
You
And
know?
is that also then reflective of, is there a tough economic climate there? What if our customers don't have enough money
Yeah,
to, come see us? So you're right. All these complexities play off of each other. And that's where paralysis of analysis comes in, is people start measuring the 10 things, but without a model to then digest that data in an actionable way, because you can start spiraling about so many of these. And that's what I've witnessed in
right.
so many meetings.
Yeah, I think this is gonna get worse. Because we have tariffs, we got rising costs and inflation rising costs, and then the rising cost of materials to build. And I was actually talking at an ICSC conference with I think is the director of real estate for Kava. I might be wrong about that, but he was saying like, man, getting people to work is actually
Hmm.
the hardest thing. And what I heard him say was, there are some locations where I know I'm not going to be able to get high school labor. 100%. I know I'm not going to be able to get them. Just basically, the kids have better options for jobs or don't need a job at all. Is this coming up more for you in
Oh,
particular
100%.
industries?
Finding people to work, especially in the retail and restaurant sectors and in back of house, is one of the highest, I'd say number one highest concern for people.
Yeah.
And the immigration laws that, regardless of what side of politics you sit on with this, it is affecting the restaurant business in a very, very big way. A lot of people are counting on that population as staff, and all in the legal way, right? Those people who are legally allowed to work in the U.S. who are no becoming less and less available, or maybe scared to come to work, or like these are real things that the industry is seeing, and we just have to acknowledge it.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think of our segments often from like how much money can you make from this population, but I've been thinking recently is culturally, are they aligned to work? Like, do they affect the cause side of the equation? Okay. Next thing, occupancy costs.
This one's easy. We probably don't need to spend too much time on it, but I think everyone, most people who are involved in growing brands understand this, because this has been really the only metric that so many people used. And I often call it like the persuasion of a free look is what led people astray initially. Is you have an operator who says, we don't really know which market to go to, but brokers are free. So let's engage real estate brokers and we will go look at these three markets. So let's look at Phoenix and Denver and Texas. Well, if you engage in a real estate broker to, investigate a market, it is their job to look at real estate and to understand the real estate costs. It is also important to remember that that is only 8% of the P&L. And so many people are guided in these real estate strategies forgetting to measure the other 92% of the P&L, and they're driven, you know, by the persuasion of a free look into a market, and they believe that a market is good or bad based off of what the expense of the real estate is or the availability of the real estate. So yes, this is a really important factor. I mean, this is why we remind people this is one of 10 things that should be measured. It shouldn't be the only thing. But it is important, of course.
This feels like it would be a worse problem with retailers with 1 to maybe 50 units, where they are literally relying on the expertise of the broker, and the expertise of the broker may be great, but is not taking into account the other 92% of the picture that's relevant to the
Absolutely. And
retail
that's
brand.
nothing against brokers. It is not their job, right? It is not their job to worry
Right.
about your labor
Yep.
cost and your construction and your COGS, which is the next one.
Yep. Okay. Let's get into cost of goods sold.
As many people would know this. This is one of the largest items on a P&L, typically between 30 and 40%. So how much does it cost you as an operator to get your product to your four walls? And this is highly reliant on distribution hubs. So if there are, let's pretend for a minute you're an operator and you have three distribution hubs across the country and you're trying to decide which location or which market, your proximity to one of those distribution hubs will have a huge impact in those costs. Or your ability to get those goods into a certain market will have, from one side of the country to another is a huge cost factor. So many people know In and Out. In and Out, didn't go to many markets for a long time because they wouldn't freeze and ship. So they had to have, they had to justify at least 3 to 5 locations or stores to be able to build those distribution centers for those specific locations. So it does affect strategy very often. But again, it typically does not come into strategy or strategic planning for operators because it's just been hard to model around. So highly important, of course, and making sure that you can get goods into a certain market is also really important. So I have a client who had a very specific seafood. So one of their biggest items was crawfish, and come to realize that they didn't have a distribution partner who could get crawfish into certain markets. So to even think, and spend resources on trying to infiltrate a market that doesn't have a COGS solution before you have that solution is just a waste of resources. So these are the types of things that we uncover and help on the infrastructure piece.
Yeah. And then last here is profitability, and this is just the adding up of all these. Anything else that you'd say about
It's
profitability?
it's the most important thing. It's the most important thing. And when we build these models, we test it against the current fleet. So what we do is we have a score for these 10 things. It gives us a seeker score. And then that seeker score is weighed against the SLEBADA or the store level earnings of an existing fleet. And we'll be able
Never heard sleep it out,
Yeah,
but
there
it's
you
a funny
go.
word.
It's funny how
Yeah.
new that is to a lot of people. People know EBITDA, right? And they know earnings, right?
Yeah.
And so SLEPADA is to say what is the earnings of that specific location. So not the top line, right? But the bottom line. And we'll be able to show the
Hmm.
correlation of our seeker score in a way that says, okay, now we understand that anything below, A2 has a risk for profitability based off of that fleet. And we know every
Mm-hmm. Because you're modeling it against a proxy, like this store is like this store, but we've quantified how it is like this store and
based
how it
on
is
the
not
10
like the
things.
other.
So, of those sales drivers and cost drivers, how can we model your ability to be profitable? And so often we've modeled this with existing brands who have, I'd call it mistakes. Maybe they could have been successful if they had sequenced properly or any of the number of things we talked about, but we're able to show them that had we used these 10 things, here are the markets or the sites that are showing negative scores where you are unprofitable. And we could have avoided risk
Yes.
mitigation tool as much as a strategy tool or anything else. Let's avoid investing $1 to $4 million on this real estate if you can run this model in advance and show you that the headwinds are too great, and either you can mitigate those headwinds and depending on which 10 things are negative, or you can't, and you should just avoid it.
Yeah, and at least you're going in eyes wide open when you're choosing, like, okay, we're red here. Well, then and then you know how to deal
Yeah.
with that effectively, which is really great. And one of the things that I was wanting to mention before is I love the transparency that you get here. And I feel like there are places that if you have, like, if you're Subway or Dollar General, you can just rely on the model and you can get away with a lot because it's like you got a lot of math around that model and you can just do a black box random forest and you can figure out the next couple locations for your location. But if you're an emerging brand, you need to know why something didn't work. Like you don't have the room to make these mistakes, and if you do make the mistake, you better learn from it or else you'll make it again, and like you can't make that many, especially with the real estate environment now. You cannot be making those mistakes going
100%, and be
forward.
able to explain that to your financial partners or your funding will dry up.
Yep. Oh yeah, 100%. Um, Lessons from setbacks. Do you have a moment where you had a setback or things didn't go according to plan that you learned from?
I think this is so important. as part of this infrastructure piece, we have these rules that we use internally and also with our clients. And I quote Enrico Fermi all the time, of who's a nuclear scientist, and he said, if you get something right, you've made a measurement. If you get it wrong, you've made a discovery. And just that mentality is so important for us as,
Mm.
seekers who are trying to problem solve every day, and also for operators, is it's only a failure if you can't learn and model around it. Otherwise, if you take the true scientific method, we have to expect for some things to go wrong. We have to expect for some units to underperform. And having the tools, like you just said, to learn from it and model around it and solve for it, you're actually gaining value in your future white space analysis from that error because you've now built it into the model. So the value you can earn from modeling against that error could be, 100x the loss, as long as you're learning from it. So from a philosophy perspective, this is a big part of, those setbacks are only setbacks if they're not moving you forward. From a personal perspective, I mean, Seeker exists because I was left without a job March of 2020. Like so many people, one
Hmm.
day I had a job, the next day I didn't, because it was all's fair in love and war, right in the middle of COVID. And I had to figure out how to feed my family, and I knew I was really good at helping restaurants stay profitable and retailers stay profitable in the midst of crisis. After 20 years, I
Mm.
understood these 10 things in a way where I could look at a crisis situation and be a solvency expert. And so I was able to help so many concepts that were really struggling, ask the right questions, and focus not on just a rent reduction, which is a short term solution, but more of a profitability strategy that helped a lot of restaurants, stay afloat that would have gone bankrupt. So I'm thankful for what felt like a really awful, scary time because it forced me to launch Seeker. And here we are 5 years later.
Yeah, let's go. Man, I did not know that story. That's how it started. And I feel like there's two types of people that can go through crisis situation. One gets super conservative, and then the other one plays all out. And I like the one that plays all out. That's the one that has my heart. And as I'm hearing you talk through this, what I'm hearing you say is that there are these ways that you could make a short-term game. Okay, cheaper rent. And all you're doing is saying, that is part of the picture, but let me show you this full picture. And I really feel like you're coming from this from a long-term strategy where you're talking to the client saying eventually where do you want to go? And that determines how you sequence a market. Might already talked about this, but personally philosophy, what is your core belief or philosophy that's guided your approach to
Yes,
business
this
and life?
one, I mean, Seeker has so many, but just the name Seeker, people are like, what, why is it spelled wrong? Well, it's like, it's spelled differently. We spell Seeker differently because we want to think differently. We want to take a different kind of approach to business. And much of that is just being curious. So often I think we believe that curiosity might come across as not knowing. And in our business, our value is from what we know. And we turn that on its head and say, you actually will be so much more successful if you take a curious approach to life. And we take that even to our personal relationships. And we have a rule at Seeker that we ask our clients to bring into their personal lives if they so wish to be seekers, which is if you're really angry, if you're having a conflict with someone, force yourself to be curious. And the way to do that is to like ask a question. If you want to yell at someone or be mad, force
Hmm.
yourself to ask a question. And so often that encourages curiosity that resolves the conflict. And I had a client tell
Hmm.
me, who'd been with us for a couple of years, like this rule actually changed the relationship with my spouse because I would find myself be angry and I would practice curiosity and I would realize like, oh, what was I angry about? And I misread that reaction. And that's not why that person acted this way. And so it's just an example of how um, not only does it help us solve real important problems in business, but it also, improves our personal lives with the people we love the most as well. That's something I'm proud of, right? At Seeker.
It is a bigger, brighter world when you approach it with curiosity. Very cool. Well, Ashley, this has been awesome. If people wanted to hear more about Seeker Group, how do
They
they
can go to
find
our
you?
website, theseakergroup.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. We have a number of learning tools, and we're all about learning and growing, and we'd be happy to help others along their journey. Thank you,
Thank you,
Lyden.
Ashley.
You keep rocking out there with Spatial. We're such big fans.